love can be sinful. We live in the midst of a culture that needs to hear that. It needs to hear that from us. Because it's coming at us with this whole love is love mentality. And how can you be against love? Nobody can be against love. Certainly Christians can't be against love, because God is love and we are called to love. Therefore, how can you stand in the way of any two people who love one another? But our text today makes it very clear that there are instances when love can be sinful. In other words, this is more than just a theological discussion for us to have. This is a very practical, rubber meets the road issue. This issue of love being sinful. The question is, what makes love sinful? What could possibly make love sinful? Under what circumstances would love be considered sinful? Well, first of all, love becomes sinful when it is directed at the wrong object. Love becomes sinful when it is directed at the wrong object. Look at verse 15. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Do not love the world. Now, it's very important to note that this word world, especially in Johannine literature, is used in at least three different ways. First of all, the world can refer to all creation. You see this in John 1, John 3, John 4, John 6, John 7, John 8, over and over again. This word cosmos refers to all the world, to all the created universe. John is not saying here that we should not love this universe, this world, this earth that God created. That's not what's being said here. Secondly, the term world refers to the people that inhabit this world that God created. And God is not saying, do not love people, do not love mankind. Absolutely not. We know that it doesn't mean that. Because the love that we're called to give, even to our enemies, the great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. So John can't be talking about that first world here, and he can't be talking about that second world here. That would be a contradiction. However, there is a third use of the term world. And that third use refers to the spiritual realm that is in opposition to God and in rebellion against his kingdom. It is that third sense of world that is being discussed here. So when John says, do not love the world, he says your love becomes sinful when it's directed at that system that is anti-God, that system that is anti-kingdom, that system that is satanic. And he makes it obvious that it's satanic because he uses it several times here, even in 1 John. John writes that by faith, the Christian is able to overcome the world in 1 John 5, 4 and 5. In our text, he says the world passes away. In chapter 3, verse 1, he says the world is ignorant of God. In 3:13, he says the world hates believers. In 4:1, he says it's the abode of false prophets. And 4:3, it's the abode of the Antichrist. And in 4:5, it's the abode of unbelievers. And last, the whole world is controlled by the evil one. It is obvious here that when John refers to world in this text, He's referring to that world that is under the control of our adversary, the devil. That world that is spiritual and ideological and at war with our King and his kingdom. And we are told, do not love that world. Not at all. Listen to Calvin. He had said before that the only rule for living religiously is to love God. But as when we are occupied with the vain love of the world, we turn away all our thoughts and affections another way. This vanity must first be torn away from us in order that the love of God may reign within us. Until our minds are cleansed, the former doctrine may be iterated 100 times, but with no effect. It will be like pouring water on a ball. You can gather no, not a drop, because there is no empty place to retain the water. Like pouring water on a ball. When your affections, when your love is pointed toward the world, there is no room for the love of God. Because when your love and your affections are pointed toward the world, they are pointed toward that which opposes God. Thus, love can become sinful when it is directed at the wrong object. James says something similar in James 4, in verse 4. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. No man can serve two masters. He will love the one and hate the other. This is an either-or situation. You cannot love the world and love God simultaneously. In fact, in our regeneration, in our salvation, we are taken out of the world. We're taken out of that system. We're brought out of darkness and into his marvelous light. We transfer kingdoms. We transfer allegiances. But if our love is still for the world, our allegiance has not legitimately been transferred. Which is why in 2:19, just after our passage, John says, they went out from among us because they were not all of us. If they had been of us, they would have remained. But they left so that it might be known, so that it might be obvious, so that we might see that they were never ours. They were never his. Because their love, their affections were pointed at the system that is opposed to God. 1 John 5:4, for everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. John 15:19, if you were of the world would love you as its own, but because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. John 17:16, they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. John 17:18, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. Again, we've been sent into the world to proclaim the gospel. But we're not of this world. We're in this world, but not of this world. And we are most assuredly not to love this world. A great way to see this picture is to think about the love that a man is commanded to have for his wife. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. There is a love that husbands are called to give exclusively to their wives. And the moment you turn that love onto another, you are guilty of idolatry. It's the same point here. The moment you turn that love that we are called to have for God, that love that has been shed abroad in our hearts, the minute you turn that to the world out of which you were saved, that minute you are communicating the fact that you do not have the love of God or love for God. Beloved, we must constantly examine our hearts for the presence of this love of the world. Now, be careful here, because there is a tendency to take this in very wrong directions. We've got to fight worldliness, and so what that means is you don't drink, smoke, cuss, or chew, or date the girls that do, right? That's not what this is. That's the enemy's sleight of hand. Because I can love alcohol and not drink it. Amen? I can love drugs and not take them. I can love these things. My passions and my affections can be pointed in these directions, and yet my legalism and my moralism says I'm better, not just than I was, but I'm better than you. Amen? Because I fight the urge. Because I don't participate. I still love it with every fiber of my being. John's not saying here, don't participate in the world. He says, don't love the world. We must develop discernment in order to determine the difference. But not only that, love becomes sinful when it arises from the wrong source. Not only when it's pointed in the wrong direction, pointed toward the wrong object, but when it arises from the wrong source. Verse 16. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. So there's a problem first with the object, and now here there's a problem with the source. That this love for the world arises from the world. Just like our love for God and for the things of God arises from God. It is God who gives us the capacity to love God. But here we have a love that is arising from a different source. The first two categories that are mentioned here, cravings and lust, are sinful desires. Boasting, however, is sinful behavior, from internal to external. The first two are internal and hidden sins. The last one is revealed. The first two pertain to the individual person. The last one pertains to this person in community with others. Kistemacher says. Three categories: cravings, lust, and boasting. These things arise from the world. cravings, inordinate desires for things. And again, we have to separate these two. When we say cravings and lust and boastings, we have to recognize that we're talking about this third world and not the first two. For example, in that first world, I can love the beauty of a sunset. I can love the beauty of a perfectly cooked steak. Sorry. I can I can love the beauty of music, art. Again, those things in this world that God has made. I can and I must love the people whom God has created in this world. But the kind of love that I have for those things is a love that arises from God himself. But even those loves can be perverted. And so now, instead of me loving the beauty of a sunset or a beauty of God's created order, now I worship God's created order. I worship the creature rather than the creator. Rather than loving the beauty of those things that God has given us, now all of a sudden those things become means to an end, to satisfying myself, to gratifying my flesh, to quenching my lustful desires. That's when they've crossed a boundary. And then there are these boastings. That's when it gets outward. My cravings, my lust, and then my pride. True love can lead me to share my testimony, and pride can make me exaggerate it. True love can cause me to use my voice to proclaim the truth of the gospel. Pride makes me love the sound of my voice so that I just talk too much. True love can lead me to share my story, but my pride causes me to make myself the hero of every story I tell. Can make me one of those people who constantly gives you their resume. That's what it looks like when it becomes outward. True love can show gratitude for the things with which God has blessed me, but my pride can make me constantly give you the price tag of those things so that you can be impressed. Are you smelling what I'm stepping in? So our love can become sinful based on its direction and based on its source. But finally, and ultimately, and most importantly, our love becomes sinful when it produces the wrong fruit. When it leads to the wrong ends. Look at verse 17. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. Here you have these two opposite ends. On the one hand, you have this world that is passing away, and on the other hand, you have our God who abides forever. Love becomes sinful when it leads to wrong ends and produces wrong fruit. Our passions become sinful when they are pointed in directions that lead to death and destruction, as opposed to leading to life. 1 Corinthians 7, 29 to 31. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. There is no life there. And this leads us back to what I was mentioning earlier. The poignant way in which this is so pertinent to our times. Because of the love is love crowd, particularly in the area of same-sex marriage. How can you be opposed to same-sex marriage when same-sex marriage is just about people who love each other being allowed to express that love? But that's a love that's pointed at the wrong object. That is not a love that comes from God or that brings glory and honor to God. It is pointed at the wrong object. It is a love that arises from the wrong source. Look with me, if you will, at Romans chapter 1. Beginning of verse 18, familiar passage, but I want us to look at it. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and the unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds.